Clara Harris once believed her life was a dream. As a successful dentist in Texas, she had built a career she was proud of and married a man she adored. David Harris, an orthodontist with charm and ambition, seemed to complete her perfectly. Together, they had built a thriving dental practice and created a picture-perfect family with David's teenage daughter, Lindsay. To anyone looking in, the Harrises had it all. But cracks began to form in their seemingly flawless marriage. Clara first noticed subtle changes in David's behavior. His once consistent schedule began to shift, with late nights at the office becoming more frequent. His phone calls, which he used to take openly, now ended abruptly whenever she walked into the room. His usual warm and attentive demeanor was replaced with distraction and distance. One evening, Clara set the table for dinner, her eyes drifting toward the clock. David was late again. Lindsay sat nearby, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at the door. Clara tried to mask her growing frustration. "He must have gotten held up at work," she said, more to herself than to Lindsay. When David finally walked in, his tie loosened and his expression weary, Clara greeted him with a forced smile. "Long day?" she asked, her tone laced with unspoken questions. "Yeah," he replied curtly, pressing a kiss to her cheek before heading upstairs without another word. Clara watched him go, her chest tightening. The tension grew in the weeks that followed. Clara began noticing little things that felt out of place. A faint whiff of perfume on David's shirt. A charged silence in their conversations, the way his phone was now always locked. She tried to dismiss her suspicions, convincing herself it was all in her head. But the doubts gnawed at her, keeping her awake at night. During one sleepless night, Clara sat in bed staring at the ceiling. David lay beside her, his breathing deep and even. She glanced at his phone on the nightstand, tempted to unlock it, but she hesitated, knowing what such an act might mean. If she looked, it would confirm that she didn't trust him. If she didn't, she might never know the truth. The next morning, as Clara prepared breakfast, she found a receipt tucked into David's wallet while searching for change. Her breath caught as she read it. A high-end restaurant she had never been to, dated just 2 nights earlier. She clutched it tightly, her mind racing. Was it a business dinner, a client meeting, or was it something else entirely? Clara decided to confront David, but her opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, she slid the receipt toward him. "What's this?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with tension. David glanced at it briefly before shrugging. "It was a work thing," he said, his tone dismissive. But Clara didn't miss the flicker of unease in his eyes. "You didn't mention it," she pressed, her heart pounding. "I didn't think it was important," David replied, his voice firm now. "Why are you making a big deal out of this?" Clara bit back the retort on her tongue, choosing instead to let the conversation drop. But inside, her doubts solidified into something sharper. She couldn't ignore the feeling that David was hiding something. As the days passed, Clara became increasingly consumed by suspicion. She began to notice patterns she hadn't before. Late nights followed by vague excuses, a growing distance in their relationship that felt impossible to bridge. For the first time in their marriage, Clara felt truly alone. But Clara wasn't the kind of woman to sit idly by. If there was a truth to uncover, she was determined to find it. And so she made a quiet decision that would set her on a path she could never turn back from. She would find out exactly what David was hiding, no matter the cost. The quiet tension between Clara and David had grown into an invisible wall, one Clara couldn't ignore any longer. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds as Clara poured herself a cup of coffee, her mind replaying every odd moment from the past few weeks. The late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. David's once affectionate gaze now seemed distant, distracted. She glanced across the table at Lindsay, who was absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. Clara hesitated, then spoke. "Lindsay, have you noticed anything different about your dad lately?" The teenager froze for a moment, then shrugged without looking up. "He's just been busy, I guess." But her tone betrayed her unease. Later that day, Clara's suspicions deepened when she received a phone call from one of their clinic's longtime patients, Mrs. Keene. "Clara, dear," the elderly woman began cautiously, "I don't mean to meddle, but I thought you should know. I saw David having lunch with a woman the other day. It didn't seem professional." The words hit Clara like a gust of icy wind. Trying to dismiss the pang of betrayal, Clara confronted David that evening. "Who were you with at lunch this week?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. David's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "What are you talking about? It was a client meeting. Don't start imagining things." His dismissive tone only fueled her doubts. That night, unable to sleep, Clara sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the faint glow of David's phone on the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The screen was locked. A password? That was new. Her stomach churned with dread. The next morning, Clara found herself at her desk dialing the number of a private investigator, Blue Moon Investigations. She hesitated before pressing the final digit, her heart pounding. "Am I really doing this?" she thought. But the gnawing uncertainty had become unbearable. "Hello," she said when a calm voice answered. "I need help finding out the truth." Within days, the investigator presented Clara with his initial findings. David had been visiting the same upscale restaurant multiple times in the past month, always with the same woman. The report included details that made Clara's blood run cold. Reservations made under false names, long lunches that extended into late afternoons. "We're still working to confirm her identity," the investigator added. "But from what we've observed, it doesn't look good." That evening, Clara sat in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel as tears blurred her vision. She had devoted her life to this family, to David. How could he throw it all away? The thought burned, igniting a flicker of something darker in her chest. She couldn't suppress the images forming in her mind. David laughing with another woman, holding her hand, sharing secrets. Clara clenched her fists. At dinner, the tension was palpable. Lindsay picked at her food while David seemed oblivious to the storm brewing. Clara's gaze bore into him, searching for any sign of guilt. Finally, she broke the silence. "David, if there's something I should know, now's the time to tell me." Her voice trembled, a mix of anger and desperation. David looked up, his face a mask of frustration. "Clara, drop it. You're being paranoid." His words cut like a blade. Clara stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the tile floor. "Paranoid? Don't you dare," she snapped. "I've sacrificed everything for you, for us. If you think I'm just going to sit here and let you destroy this family, you're wrong." David shook his head, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding. She knew something was deeply wrong, and now she was determined to find out exactly what it was. The next day, the investigator sent her a photo. It was a grainy image of David walking into a hotel with a woman whose face was partially obscured. Clara stared at it, her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was real. The life she thought she knew was crumbling before her eyes. The photo lingered on Clara's desk like a ghost she couldn't exorcise. Each time she looked at it, a new wave of anger, humiliation, and sorrow crashed over her. The investigator's update was clear. The woman in the photo was Gail Bridges, a former receptionist at their clinic. Clara remembered her vaguely. Attractive, younger, and always a little too friendly with David. The realization felt like a knife twisting in her gut. Clara couldn't stay silent anymore. That evening, she confronted David in the kitchen, slamming the photo onto the counter. "Who is she, David?" she demanded, her voice sharp and trembling. He glanced at the image, his face hardening. "It's not what you think," he said flatly. But his tone betrayed him, and Clara wasn't having it. "Not what I think?" she hissed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Then tell me, explain to me why you're sneaking around with someone we both know." David's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he muttered, "It was a mistake, Clara. A stupid mistake." Clara froze. The admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You call this a mistake? You've been meeting her in hotels, hiding it from me, and you think that word is enough to erase what you've done?" David didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving Clara standing there, shattered. That night, she didn't sleep. The photo burned in her mind, and David's dismissive attitude only fueled her rage. By dawn, Clara had made up her mind. She needed to know everything. She called the investigator again, her voice cold and resolute. "I want you to dig deeper," she said. "Every detail, every meeting, every lie. I want to know it all." The next report came quickly. Gail and David had been meeting for months. There were dinners, overnight stays, and even a trip to a lakeside resort. Clara read through the notes with trembling hands, feeling the last threads of her composure unravel. Gail wasn't just the other woman. She was a calculated presence in David's life, someone who had no qualms about tearing apart Clara's family. Unable to contain her anger, Clara did something she never thought she'd do. She called Gail. Her fingers shook as she dialed the number, and when Gail answered, her tone was maddeningly calm. "Hello?" Gail said, as if she didn't have a care in the world. "This is Clara Harris," Clara said, her voice icy. There was a pause, then Gail replied, "Ah, I've been expecting your call." Clara's grip on the phone tightened. "Stay away from my husband," she hissed. Gail laughed, a soft, dismissive sound that sent Clara over the edge. "He came to me, Clara," Gail said smoothly. "Maybe you should be asking yourself why." The line went dead before Clara could respond, leaving her seething with frustration and humiliation. Over the next few days, Clara's anger consumed her. She became hyper-aware of David's every move, every phone call, every excuse to stay late at work. She even drove by Gail's apartment one night, her heart pounding as she parked down the street. The lights were on, and through the window she could see David's car in the driveway. The sight was confirmation of what she already knew, but seeing it with her own eyes made it unbearable. The confrontation came to a head during dinner a few nights later. Lindsay was at the table, trying to eat quietly as Clara and David exchanged sharp words. "Do you even feel guilty?" Clara snapped. David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I told you it's over. I made a mistake and I'm trying to move on. Why can't you?" Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because you're still lying, and I won't let her win." David stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "I'm done talking about this," he yelled. Lindsay jumped, her eyes wide with fear. "Enough, both of you," she cried. "Why can't you just stop?" David left the house that night, slamming the door behind him. Lindsay ran upstairs, her sobs echoing down the hallway. And Clara sat alone at the table, her hands trembling as she stared at her untouched plate. Her family was unraveling before her eyes, and the threads were slipping faster than she could grasp them. The silence in the Harris household was louder than any argument. Days passed since David had stormed out, and the air inside the house felt heavy, stagnant, as though no one dared breathe too deeply. Clara moved through her routines on autopilot, though nothing about her life felt routine anymore. Every room in the house echoed memories of the life she thought they had, until Gail Bridges shattered it. Clara sat at the dining table one evening going through old photo albums. Page after page of smiles and celebrations mocked her, each picture a painful reminder of what she had lost. Lindsay wandered into the room, drawn by the sound of her stepmother's quiet sobs. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to speak or retreat. "Lindsay," Clara said suddenly, not looking up, "do you blame me for all this?" Her voice cracked, betraying her vulnerability. Lindsay shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I just wish things could go back to normal." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes glistening. "Normal? How can anything be normal when he's still with her?" Lindsay took a step back, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "Maybe if you didn't push so hard," Lindsay began, but Clara interrupted, her voice sharp. "Push so hard? I'm fighting for this family, for you, for us!" The tension between them lingered, a rift that neither knew how to bridge. Lindsay turned and walked away, muttering under her breath, "Sometimes it feels like you're only fighting for yourself." Later that night, Clara lay awake, her mind a storm of anger and despair. She replayed Lindsay's words over and over, wondering if there was truth in them. She wanted to believe her actions were for the greater good, for her marriage, for their family. But a small voice in her head questioned whether it was really about winning, about proving she was better than Gail. At the clinic the next day, the fractures in their personal lives began spilling into their professional world. Longtime patients noticed the tension between Clara and David. Whispered questions circulated among the staff. "Have you heard? He's seeing someone else," one receptionist whispered to another during a quiet moment. Clara overheard, her stomach tightening as shame and fury surged within her. That afternoon, Clara finally saw David. He had come to the clinic to pick up paperwork, avoiding eye contact as he moved through the office. Clara followed him into his office, shutting the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said firmly. David sighed, clearly exhausted by the situation. "Clara, I've told you everything. What more do you want from me?" Clara's composure cracked. "What do I want?" she echoed, her voice rising. "I want my husband back. I want my family back." David's face hardened. "And you think this is how you're going to get it? By controlling every move I make? By dragging Lindsay into this mess?" Clara froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "She deserves to know the truth," she said weakly, but her conviction was fading. David shook his head. "This isn't about Lindsay. It's about you and your obsession with winning. You're not trying to save this marriage. You're trying to beat Gail." The words cut deeper than Clara expected, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. David took the opportunity to leave, walking past her without another glance. The argument left Clara reeling. That night, she found herself sitting on Lindsay's bed, her heart heavy with guilt. Lindsay sat next to her, quiet but watchful. "I don't know what to do anymore," Clara confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm trying so hard, but it feels like everything I do just makes things worse." Lindsay hesitated, then spoke cautiously. Maybe you should let him go, Clara. If he doesn't want to be here, forcing him won't fix anything." Clara turned to her, stunned. "Let him go?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. If I let him go, I lose everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Clara realized she was no longer fighting for her family. She was fighting to keep herself from falling apart completely, and in doing so, she was pushing everyone else away. Clara stared at the report on her desk, her mind racing. The investigators' findings confirmed what she already knew. David was still meeting Gail. Despite his hollow assurances, the affair continued, slipping further into a realm of secrecy and betrayal. Each line of the report etched itself into her mind. The dates, the times, the places. It wasn't just infidelity, it was premeditated, calculated. She clenched her fists, the edges of the paper crumpling beneath her grip. The house was quiet that evening, except for the faint hum of the television in the living room. Lindsay sat on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, while Clara paced in the kitchen. Her thoughts spiraled into a single, undeniable conclusion. She couldn't let this continue. Her family, her life was slipping away, and Gail Bridges was the reason. Something had to be done. Clara's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from the investigator. "David has a reservation at Nassau Bay Hilton tomorrow evening, 7:30 p.m. Clara's breath hitched. Another meeting? The words felt like a slap in the face. Without thinking, she typed back, "I'll handle it from here." She set her phone down, her hands trembling as an idea began to form. It was reckless, impulsive, but the desperation that had consumed her for weeks drowned out any sense of reason. Clara walked into the living room, her voice steady but firm. "Lindsay, I need your help tomorrow night." Lindsay looked up, surprised. "With what?" she asked cautiously. Clara hesitated, searching for the right words. "Your father is meeting someone. I think it's time we both see the truth for ourselves." Lindsay's eyes widened, a mix of curiosity and dread. "You want me to go with you?" she asked. Clara nodded. "It's the only way he'll realize what he's doing to us." The next evening, Clara sat behind the wheel of her car, her grip on the steering wheel tight as they approached the hotel. Lindsay sat silently beside her, glancing nervously out the window. "Are you sure about this?" Lindsay finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara didn't answer right away. "Sometimes, Lindsay," she said softly, "people need to face their consequences." The hotel parking lot was dimly lit, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. Clara parked in the far corner, her eyes scanning the lot until they landed on David's car. She exhaled sharply, a wave of emotions crashing over her. Anger, betrayal, determination. "Wait here," she said to Lindsay, opening her door. Lindsay grabbed her arm. "No, I'm coming with you," she insisted. Clara hesitated, but the look in Lindsay's eyes was resolute. They stepped out together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet lot as they approached the entrance. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet conversations and clinking glasses. Clara's eyes darted across the room until they found him, David, sitting at a corner table with Gail. They were laughing, leaning closer than necessary. Clara's heart pounded as her vision blurred with rage. She stepped forward, but Lindsay's hand on her arm stopped her. "Mom, wait," Lindsay whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should think this through." But Clara couldn't hear her. The months of lies, the humiliation, the loneliness, it all surged to the surface, drowning out Lindsay's words. Clara stormed toward the table, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. David looked up, his smile fading as his eyes met hers. "Clara, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Clara ignored him, her gaze fixed on Gail. "So this is her," she said coldly. "The woman who destroyed my family." Gail raised an eyebrow, her expression unbothered. "David made his choices," she said calmly. "Maybe you should look at yourself before blaming me." The words were like gasoline on an open flame. Clara stepped closer, her voice rising. You have no idea what you've done. You think you've won, don't you? The room seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation escalated. David stood, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Clara, stop. This isn't the place. But Clara was past the point of reason. You've humiliated me, she spat. In front of her, in front of everyone, you've destroyed everything we built. Gail smirked, her calm demeanor infuriatingly intact. Maybe it wasn't as strong as you thought, she said. Clara lunged forward, but David stepped between them, his face set in frustration. Enough, he barked, his voice echoing through the lobby. Trembling with rage, Clara turned and stormed out, Lindsay hurrying after her. They climbed into the car, the silence between them deafening. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel as she stared at the hotel, her chest heaving. I won't let her take him, she whispered, her voice low and resolute. Not like this. Lindsay looked at her, fear and confusion etched across her face. Mom, what are you going to do? But Clara didn't answer. She didn't know yet. All she knew was that the game had changed, and she wasn't about to lose. The drive back to the Nassau Bay Hilton felt endless, the car's silence punctuated only by the rhythmic sound of tires against asphalt. Clara's mind raced with fragments of the confrontation from the night before, David's smug attempts at damage control, Gail's taunting smirk, Lindsay's trembling voice begging her to leave. Clara had left, but the battle was far from over. This time she wasn't walking into the hotel unprepared. Clara had resolved to put an end to the charade. As they pulled into the parking lot, she noticed David's car parked in the same spot, taunting her with its familiarity. Her heart pounded with renewed intensity. Next to her, Lindsay fidgeted nervously. Mom, maybe we should just go home, she murmured. Clara didn't answer. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was subdued, yet the air felt electric to Clara. Her eyes scanned the lobby until they locked onto the bar. There he was, David, sitting beside Gail again, leaning in close, their faces lit by dim amber light. Clara's chest tightened as she forced herself to remain calm. But her steps quickened as she approached, her resolve hardening with every breath. The sound of her heels clicking on the marble floor caught David's attention. He turned, his eyes widening in shock. Clara, he said sharply, standing up. His voice carried both anger and fear, but Clara didn't flinch. She stopped mere feet away from them, her gaze burning into Gail. So this is what you've been sneaking around for, Clara said, her voice laced with venom. Gail leaned back in her chair, sipping her drink nonchalantly. Clara, she said with a condescending smile, you really need to learn how to let go. It's embarrassing at this point. Clara's hands balled into fists at her sides. Let go? She snapped, her voice rising. You've destroyed my marriage. You've torn apart my family. And you sit there smug like you've won something. David stepped between them, his arms outstretched. That's enough, Clara, he said firmly, though his voice wavered. This isn't the time or the place, but Clara was beyond reason. You don't get to tell me what's enough, she shouted, her voice echoing across the lobby. You brought this on yourself, David, you and her. Her gaze flicked back to Gail, who simply shrugged, as if the chaos unfolding was beneath her concern. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the escalating tension. Clara turned, addressing them with a bitter laugh. Look at them, the perfect couple, she said mockingly. They think they can do whatever they want, hurt whoever they want, and just walk away. Clara, stop, David hissed, his face flushed with embarrassment. You're making a scene. Good, Clara shot back. Maybe someone should finally see you for what you are, a liar and a coward. Her voice cracked, her pain bleeding through the anger. The room seemed to hold its breath as Clara's words hung in the air. Suddenly, Gail stood, placing her hand on David's arm. She's not worth it, she said coldly. Let's go. Clara lunged forward, but a hotel security guard intervened, stepping between them. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, he said sternly. Clara glared at the guard, her fury barely contained, but then she saw Lindsay standing near the entrance, her face pale and stricken. Clara's heart twisted. She had dragged her daughter into this mess, forcing her to witness the ugliness of it all. Reluctantly, Clara backed away, her chest heaving with the effort to restrain herself. This isn't over, she said, her voice trembling with rage. She turned and walked out, each step heavier than the last. Back in the car, Lindsay's voice was soft but firm. Mom, you can't keep doing this. It's not going to bring him back. Clara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. You don't understand, she whispered. I can't let her win. They sat in silence for a long moment before Clara started the car, her jaw set. The confrontation had left her shaken but more determined than ever. Gail Bridges wasn't just another woman, she was the enemy, and Clara wasn't going to lose to her. The parking lot was drenched in an eerie quietness, illuminated only by the dull orange glow of streetlights. Clara sat in her car, her knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each exhale clouding her vision as if the air itself carried her frustration. In the passenger seat, Lindsay sat stiffly, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the hotel entrance. Clara's gaze was locked on David's car, parked several rows away. It was a cruel symbol of everything that had gone wrong, every betrayal, every lie, every moment that had stolen her life's stability. She didn't know how long they sat there, waiting, the silence between her and Lindsay growing heavier with each passing second. "Mom," Lindsay finally whispered, her voice trembling, "can we just go home, please?" Clara's jaw clenched. "No," she said flatly, "not yet." The sound of laughter broke the stillness. Clara's eyes snapped toward the hotel doors, and there they were, David and Gail arm in arm, as though they didn't have a care in the world. Clara felt her pulse quicken, her vision narrowing on the pair, as if the world beyond them ceased to exist. David opened the passenger door for Gail, and she slid into the seat with practiced ease, her laughter still ringing through the night air. Clara's heart pounded furiously. Lindsay noticed the change in her mother's posture and reached out a trembling hand. "Mom, don't..." But it was too late. Clara's foot pressed down on the gas and the car lurched forward with a screech. Lindsay screamed, "Mom, stop!" But the sound was drowned out by the roar of the engine and the thunderous pounding in Clara's ears. The world moved in slow motion. David turned, his face frozen in shock as the car barreled toward him. Clara slammed the brakes at the last second, the car screeching to a halt mere feet away. David stumbled backward, his hands raised in defense. "Are you insane?" he shouted, his voice echoing across the lot. Clara's hands shook violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Get in the car, David," she growled, her voice low and threatening. "We're going home, now." Gail stepped out of the car, her face a mix of outrage and disdain. "She's lost it," Gail said, her voice sharp. "David, don't get in that car." "Shut up," Clara roared, her voice cracking with fury. "This is between me and my husband." David stood frozen, torn between the two women. "Clara, go home," he said firmly. "We'll talk about this later." "Later?" Clara screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "You think there's a later after this? After everything you've done? After her?" Lindsay climbed out of the car, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, please stop. You're scaring me," she cried, her voice breaking. Her words seemed to pierce through Clara's haze of rage, but only for a moment. Clara's eyes darted back to Gail, who was smirking again, leaning casually against David's car. "You're pathetic," Gail said coldly. "This is why he doesn't want you anymore." The words hit Clara like a slap, and something inside her snapped. Without thinking, she hit the accelerator. The car lunged forward, clipping the side of David's legs and sending him sprawling to the ground. Gail screamed, and Lindsay's cries turned into hysterical sobs. "Mom, stop! You're going to kill him!" Lindsay screamed, clawing at the door handle to get out. Clara slammed the brakes again, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stared at David, who lay motionless on the pavement, groaning in pain. Gail knelt beside him, shouting for help. The distant sound of voices and approaching footsteps barely registered in Clara's ears. Her focus was entirely on David's crumpled form. A security guard appeared, rushing toward the scene. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," he commanded. Clara didn't move, her mind spiraling as reality began to sink in. Lindsay was screaming, Gail was shouting, and David was struggling to sit up, his face twisted in pain. The guard opened the driver's door and gently pulled Clara from the car. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," he said firmly, but his words barely registered. Clara stood there, trembling, staring at David, as though seeing him for the first time. Lindsay ran to her father, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara's lips quivered as she whispered, "I just wanted my family back." The flashing red and blue lights painted the hotel parking lot in chaotic streaks of color. Clara stood motionless, her body trembling as two police officers approached her. Their voices were calm but firm, cutting through the fog of noise around her. "Ma'am, we need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back," one of them said. Lindsay's sobs echoed across the lot. "No, stop! Don't take her!" she cried, clutching her father, who sat slumped on the pavement, his hand pressed against his bleeding leg. David winced in pain, his face contorted with a mix of shock and disbelief. Gail hovered nearby, her phone pressed to her ear as she shouted for an ambulance. Clara didn't resist. She barely moved as the cold steel cuffs clicked around her wrists. Her gaze was fixed on David, who refused to look at her. The officer guided her toward the patrol car, the murmurs of onlookers growing louder as they tried to piece together the scene. "Why did you do this, ma'am?" the officer asked quietly as he opened the car door. Clara didn't answer. Her mind replayed the moment of impact over and over, a reel she couldn't stop. She whispered to herself, "I just wanted to make it stop." Inside the patrol car, the reality of her actions began to sink in. The engine's hum was the only sound as the officer drove away, leaving behind the chaos. Clara leaned her head against the window, her tears leaving streaks on the glass. For the first time, she felt the crushing weight of regret. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. At the station, Clara was processed with quiet efficiency, fingerprints, mugshots, the monotony of procedures that stripped her of the last semblance of control. The room was cold, sterile, and unforgiving. She sat in the holding cell, her hands shaking in her lap, as fragments of her life flickered through her mind. David's smile on their wedding day, Lindsay's laughter during family vacations. It all felt so distant now, unreachable. Hours later, an officer entered, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice neutral. "We have video evidence of the incident." A private investigator handed it over. Clara's head snapped up, her blood running cold. Of course, the investigator, the very person she had hired to expose David's lies, had inadvertently sealed her fate. The video played in the next room, and Clara could hear the faint audio, the roar of her car, Lindsay's screams, Gail's frantic shouts. It was all there, captured in devastating clarity. The officers exchanged glances as they reviewed the footage. "This doesn't look like an accident," one of them said grimly. Meanwhile, Lindsay sat outside the interrogation room, her knees pulled to her chest, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. She couldn't stop hearing the sound of the car, the impact, her father's cries of pain. A deep chasm had opened in her heart, one that no amount of time could fill. David, now bandaged and resting in the hospital, refused to comment when reporters descended upon the scene. But Gail was less reserved. "She's unstable," Gail told a local news station, her tone tinged with satisfaction. "I've been telling David for months that this would happen." By the time Clara was brought into the interrogation room, the weight of her actions had fully settled. The detective across from her looked at her with a mixture of pity and stern professionalism. "Clara," he began, "we need you to explain what happened tonight." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I couldn't take it anymore. He was tearing us apart." The detective leaned forward, his voice steady. "This wasn't the way to fix things, Clara. You know that, don't you?" She nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "I lost myself," she whispered. "I just wanted my family back." As the clock ticked on, Clara's fate began to take shape. The evidence against her was undeniable. The video, the witnesses, the bruises left on David's body. But what haunted her most wasn't the trial she knew was coming. It was the realization that she had destroyed the very thing she was trying to protect. The courtroom was a theater of tension, every seat filled with spectators eager to witness the unraveling of a family tragedy. The media dubbed it the case of the jilted wife, and the air buzzed with anticipation as Clara Harris was led into the room. She wore a muted navy dress, her face pale and expressionless, yet her eyes betrayed the turmoil beneath. The whispers among the crowd grew louder as the judge entered and called the session to order. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man named Garrett Cole, rose to his feet. His voice was steady, methodical as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about rage. It's about a woman who let her emotions control her actions, and in doing so turned her car into a weapon." He gestured to the large screen where the damning video footage was displayed, frozen on the moment Clara's car lunged toward David. "This is not an accident. This was intent." The defense attorney, Marianne Fuller, followed. Her approach was softer, more personal. "Clara Harris is not a monster," she began. "She's a mother, a wife, and a woman pushed to the brink. This is not a story of premeditated violence, but of a heartbroken woman acting in the heat of passion." Marianne's words hung in the air, attempting to soften the image of Clara as the jury glanced toward her. The first witness was the private investigator Clara had hired, now testifying for the prosecution. His voice was matter-of-fact as he recounted the events leading up to that night. "She wanted to know the truth about her husband's infidelity," he explained, "but I don't think she was prepared for what she found." The video was played in full. The courtroom fell silent as the sounds of screeching tires and Lindsay's screams filled the air. Clara kept her head down, her hands trembling in her lap. David sat at the prosecution's table, his leg in a brace, his face stoic but weary. Gail Bridges sat beside him, her demeanor unapologetic, even smug. When Lindsay took the stand, the atmosphere shifted. Her presence, so fragile yet determined, drew the jury's full attention. The prosecutor approached her gently. "Lindsay, can you tell us what you remember from that night?" he asked. Lindsay's voice wavered, but she spoke clearly. "I remember begging her to stop," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I told her she was going to hurt him, but she wouldn't listen." Her words hung heavy in the room, and Clara visibly flinched. Lindsay's gaze never met her stepmother's. The defense countered with questions meant to elicit sympathy. "Lindsay, do you think your stepmother intended to hurt your father?" Marianne asked softly. "I don't know," Lindsay whispered, her voice breaking. "I think she just lost control." The prosecution then called Gail to the stand. Her testimony was scathing, painting Clara as unstable and vindictive. "She hated me," Gail said bluntly, her eyes narrowing. "She couldn't stand the idea that David chose me. She was obsessed with winning him back." When it was Clara's turn to testify, the courtroom held its breath. She stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "I never wanted to hurt him," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I just wanted him to see how much he was hurting us, how much he was tearing this family apart." The cross-examination was ruthless. The prosecutor pressed her on every detail, every action leading up to the incident. "Mrs. Harris, you claim this wasn't intentional, yet you accelerated not once but twice. How do you explain that?" Clara's voice cracked. "I wasn't thinking. I was consumed by everything, the betrayal, the humiliation. I lost myself in that moment." As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence seemed insurmountable. The video, the testimonies, the fractured relationships all pointed toward Clara's guilt. Yet the defense continued to hammer home the idea of passion, of a woman who acted not out of malice but out of desperation. The final moments of the day brought David to the stand. His voice was calm, measured, but his words cut deep. "She wasn't the woman I married anymore," he said. "I don't think she even recognized herself that night." Clara's heart sank as she listened, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. She had wanted to save her family, but now it seemed that all she had done was destroy it. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent as the jury filed back in. All eyes turned to the foreperson, who carried a single slip of paper that would decide Clara's fate. The judge, seated high above the tension, gestured for the proceedings to begin. Clara sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breathing shallow but controlled. To her left, her attorney whispered, "No matter what happens, stay composed." The foreperson rose, clearing their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Clara Harris, guilty of murder." The words landed like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile stillness. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by hushed murmurs. Clara closed her eyes, her body trembling as the reality of the verdict seeped in. Lindsay, seated near the back of the room, broke into silent tears, her hands covering her face. David's expression remained neutral, unreadable, though his grip on his cane tightened. Gail, seated beside him, allowed a small, satisfied smirk to cross her lips before quickly masking it. "Order in the court," the judge barked, silencing the crowd. He turned his gaze to Clara, his expression stern but not unkind. "Mrs. Harris, please rise." Clara stood on unsteady legs, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. She looked straight ahead, refusing to meet the gazes of the jury, her family, or the spectators. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read the sentence. "Given the severity of the crime and the overwhelming evidence presented, this court sentences you, Clara Harris, to 20 years in the custody of the state penitentiary." A sharp cry erupted from Lindsay. "No!" she shouted, standing abruptly. The bailiff moved quickly to escort her out, but her sobs echoed in the chamber as the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind her. Clara turned slightly, watching her stepdaughter being led away. Her chest tightened, guilt and despair threatening to consume her. This wasn't just her punishment, it was Lindsay's too, and David's, and everyone else's. As the courtroom emptied, Clara was led away in handcuffs. Reporters outside clamored for sound bites, shoving microphones toward anyone who would speak. "A tragic ending for a once perfect family," one anchor declared as cameras panned over the scene. Clara Harris, a woman scorned, now faces decades behind bars. In the holding cell, the weight of it all finally crushed her. Clara slumped against the wall, her head in her hands. She replayed every moment in her mind, hiring the investigator, the confrontation at the hotel, Lindsay's pleas, David's betrayal. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment she had lost herself, but somewhere along the way, her love had turned into an uncontrollable fury. Hours later, Lindsay visited her. They sat across from each other, separated by a glass partition. Lindsay's face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. Clara lifted the receiver, her hands shaking. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" Lindsay asked, her voice trembling. "Why couldn't you just walk away?" Clara pressed her hand against the glass, her eyes pleading. "I thought I was protecting us. I thought if I could just make him see." She trailed off, unable to finish. Lindsay shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You didn't protect anyone. You destroyed everything." Their conversation ended in silence, and Clara was escorted back to her cell. As she lay on the thin cot that night, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the cell doors locking echoed in her mind. For the first time, she allowed herself to confront the truth. This was her doing. There was no going back. The next day, as Clara was transported to the state penitentiary, the streets outside the courthouse were lined with protesters, news vans, and onlookers. Some held signs declaring justice had been served. Others decried the system for failing to acknowledge her pain, her humanity. Clara didn't look at them. Her gaze was fixed ahead, her face a mask of resignation. The van pulled away, leaving the courthouse and the life she once knew behind. The finality of it all was suffocating, yet a small, fragile voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward finding herself again. But it was a long road ahead, one she would walk alone. The house on Maplewood Drive felt like a mausoleum. It was silent now, its once warm atmosphere replaced by a chilling emptiness. The framed photos of happier times on the walls seemed like cruel jokes, remnants of a life that no longer existed. Lindsay walked through the living room, her footsteps echoing faintly. She paused by a picture of herself, Clara, and David at a beach from years ago. She was smiling so brightly then, it felt like another lifetime. David had moved out shortly after the trial. He didn't say much, just packed his things and left. Lindsay couldn't blame him. She wasn't sure she could stay either, but every time she thought about leaving, guilt anchored her. Someone had to be there to hold on to what little was left, even if it was just an empty shell of a family. At school, Lindsay was treated like a ghost. People whispered about her as she passed through the halls. Friends she'd known for years suddenly didn't know what to say to her. Even teachers seemed unsure, their pitying glances almost unbearable. One day during lunch, a classmate muttered loud enough for Lindsay to hear, "Her mom's a murderer, you know." Lindsay's tray clattered to the ground as she stormed out, tears streaming down her face. At work, David struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy. Patients at the clinic avoided eye contact, their polite smiles thinly veiling their curiosity. Gail's presence didn't help. Though she tried to act professional, her smugness was palpable. She treated the clinic as if she were its queen, her laughter echoing in the halls where Clara's dedication once thrived. But David's relationship with Gail wasn't as triumphant as it appeared. The cracks began to show almost immediately. Gail hated the public scrutiny, the whispers and judgment that followed her everywhere. "This isn't what I signed up for, David," she snapped one evening, slamming a glass on the counter. He didn't respond, just stared into the distance, his face etched with regret. Clara's name remained in the headlines for weeks, each new article dissecting the tragedy from every angle. Some painted her as a cold-blooded villain, while others framed her as a desperate woman driven to the edge. Talk shows debated her case endlessly. Was this justice or an act of societal misogyny? One commentator asked. But Clara herself was far from the noise. In prison, the world outside felt like a distant memory. In her cell, Clara clung to the letters Lindsay had sent her. They were sparse and guarded, but they were something. "I'm still mad at you," one letter read, the handwriting shaky. "But I don't hate you. I don't know how to feel anymore." Clara read those words over and over, her tears staining the page. Months passed and the world moved on, but the wounds in the Harris family remained raw. Lindsay visited Clara once, reluctantly, after months of prodding from David. The prison walls loomed over her as she sat across from her stepmother, the glass partition separating them. Clara looked thinner, her once polished demeanor replaced by quiet exhaustion. "Hi," Lindsay said, her voice barely audible. Clara smiled faintly, her hands trembling as she picked up the receiver. "Hi, sweetheart. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Lindsay finally broke it. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice cracking. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect you to," she replied softly. "I just want you to know I never stopped loving you, or your dad." Lindsay swallowed hard, the lump in her throat nearly choking her. "It doesn't feel like love," she whispered. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her. "I know," she said. "I know." As the visit ended, Lindsay walked away, her heart heavier than ever. She didn't know if she'd come back, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely numb. Maybe time would help. Maybe it wouldn't. But for now, all she could do was take things one day at a time. Back in the house on Maplewood Drive, Lindsay stood in front of the photo again. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the glass. "We used to be happy," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Why couldn't it stay that way?" Clara sat on the edge of her narrow prison cot, a journal balanced on her lap. The pages were worn, filled with shaky handwriting that traced her journey through the past year. She wrote every day now, letters to Lindsay, reflections on her actions, and sometimes just words of regret. Each line was an attempt to make sense of what she had done, to find meaning in the wreckage of her choices. The prison was a stark and unforgiving place, but over time, Clara had learned to navigate its rhythms. She spent her mornings working in the library, shelving books and assisting other inmates. In the afternoons, she attended group therapy sessions where she shared pieces of her story with women who carried their own burdens. The process was painful, but it was necessary. Slowly, she was beginning to understand herself in a way she never had before. One afternoon, Clara stood in the prison's recreation yard, staring at the distant horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the gray walls. Another inmate approached her, a woman named Marisol, who had become something of a confidant. "You've been quiet today," Marisol said, leaning against the fence beside her. Clara sighed, her gaze fixed on the fading light. "It's Lindsay's birthday," she said softly. "She's 16 today." Marisol nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Have you heard from her?" "Not since her last letter," Clara replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "She said she didn't know if she'd ever visit again. I can't blame her." Marisol was silent for a moment, then said, "You're doing the work, Clara. That's all you can do. Maybe one day she'll see that." Clara nodded, but the ache in her chest remained. She had written Lindsay a letter that morning, wishing her a happy birthday and telling her how proud she was of the young woman she was becoming. She didn't know if Lindsay would read it, but she sent it anyway. It was all she could do. Months passed, and the seasons changed. One day, Clara was called to the visitation room unexpectedly. Her heart raced as she sat down at the small table, wondering who it could be. When Lindsay appeared on the other side of the glass, Clara's breath caught. She looked older, more composed, but her eyes carried the same sadness that had haunted her since the trial. Clara picked up the receiver, her hand trembling. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," Lindsay replied, her tone guarded. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Lindsay broke the silence. "I got your letter," she said. "Thank you." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "I meant every word," she said. "I'm so proud of you, Lindsay. I always have been." Lindsay's eyes glistened, but she held her composure. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice cracking, "but I'm trying." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "That's all I could ever ask for," she said. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Lindsay nodded, and for the first time in years, a faint smile crossed her face. It was small, tentative, but it was there. The visit ended too soon, but as Clara watched Lindsay walk away, she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Back in her cell, Clara opened her journal and wrote a single sentence. "Today, I saw the light again." In the years that followed, Clara continued her journey of self-reflection and growth. She became a mentor to younger inmates, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. "Love is powerful," she told them during a group session, "but when it turns into obsession, it can destroy everything." Lindsay visited occasionally, their relationship slowly mending. It was a long road, filled with ups and downs, but they were both trying. For Clara, each visit was a reminder of what she had lost and what she still had to fight for. As Clara lay in her bunk one night, staring at the cracked ceiling, she whispered a quiet prayer. It wasn't for forgiveness or redemption, but for strength. strength to keep moving forward, strength to face each new day with the resolve to be better, and for the first time she believed it might be possible. What do you think of Clara Harris and her actions? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. We'd love to hear your perspective.